January 7, 1945, Antwerp, Belgium. The harbor stretched endlessly beneath the steel-gray winter sky, a forest of cranes swaying against the wind like skeletal sentinels. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel stood at the window of a captured Allied headquarters, watching through binoculars as the port below moved with mechanical precision. Ships, dozens of them, lined the docks in perfect intervals, their hulls heavy with cargo that seemed to flow from their holds like water from an infinite well. Trucks formed orderly columns that snaked inland, disappearing into the Belgian countryside. The air tasted of diesel fuel and salt water, and beneath it all, the grinding rhythm of industry pulsed without pause, without rest, without mercy. Von Manteuffel lowered the binoculars slowly, his face expressionless, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that military academies do not prepare officers to face. Not fear, precisely. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that what he witnessed through that winter window was not merely logistics, not merely supply, but the physical manifestation of a power so vast and so alien to European understanding that it redefined the very nature of modern warfare. He had commanded panzers across the frozen steppes of Russia, had orchestrated the last desperate thrust through the Ardennes just weeks earlier. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this sight, an entire industrial civilization projecting its strength across an ocean with the casual efficiency of a farmer tending his fields. The German High Command had always known that America possessed industrial capacity. This was not revelation. What they had not understood, what they could not have understood from their position within a continent that had torn itself apart twice in 30 years, was the nature of that capacity, its scale, its flexibility, its seemingly supernatural ability to transform raw abundance into military supremacy across distances that should have made such domination impossible. The story begins not at Antwerp, but in the sterile conference rooms of Berlin, in the years before the European continent exploded into total war. German military planners, heirs to the Prussian traditions of Clausewitz and Moltke, approached the problem of America with characteristic methodical precision. They understood tonnage, they understood production figures, they understood the theoretical challenges of transatlantic projection. What they failed to grasp was something more fundamental, something that resisted the categorization of their carefully maintained ledgers and strategic assessments. In 1938, the Reich War Ministry commissioned extensive studies on American industrial potential. The reports filled volumes, detailing steel production in Pittsburgh, automobile manufacturing in Detroit, shipyard capacity in Newport News. The numbers were impressive, even worrying, but they existed as abstractions on paper statistics divorced from the visceral reality of what they represented. General Franz Halder, who would later serve as chief of the Army General Staff, reviewed these documents with the cool detachment of a man who had spent his life studying warfare as an exact science. He noted the figures, acknowledged the potential threat, and then filed the reports away with a confidence born from European assumptions about distance, logistics, and the inherent limitations of power projection. The Atlantic Ocean was 5,000 kilometers of cold, deep water. The Wehrmacht planners calculated that even if American factories could produce war material in the quantities suggested the challenge of moving those supplies across an ocean, vulnerable to U-boats subject to winter storms, dependent on convoy systems that could be disrupted, would constrain American effectiveness to manageable levels. They had seen the American Expeditionary Force in the previous war, remembered its late arrival, its dependence on Allied infrastructure, its slow mobilization. Surely history would repeat itself, perhaps with improvements, but nothing that would fundamentally alter the strategic calculus. They were wrong in ways they could not have imagined. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor, they set in motion a transformation that would reshape the global order. The American response was not merely military mobilization, it was industrial metamorphosis on a scale unprecedented in human history. Within weeks, automobile factories that had produced sedans and coupes began rolling out tanks and jeeps. Shipyards that had built cargo vessels and passenger liners started laying down the keels of Liberty ships with assembly line efficiency that would have seemed fantastical to European observers. The entire productive capacity of a continental nation, protected by oceans and untouched by the devastation that had ravaged Europe and Asia, turned itself toward a single purpose with terrifying focus. German intelligence watched this transformation through fragmented reports, decoded intercepts, and occasional reconnaissance flights. They noted the figures with growing unease, but still, they did not truly comprehend. Numbers on a page could not convey the reality of American production facilities running 3 shifts around the clock, of women taking positions on assembly lines as men deployed overseas, of an entire society reorganizing itself with a pragmatic efficiency that borrowed equally from capitalist innovation and centralized direction. By 1942, the United States was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. This alone should have been revelation enough, but the truly shocking development was still to come. Production meant nothing if supplies could not reach the fighting fronts, and between American factories and European battlefields lay the Atlantic 5,000 kilometers of ocean that German strategists had counted on as their natural defense. The U-boat campaign was supposed to solve this problem. Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded hundreds of submarines, sleek predators that prowled beneath the waves, targeting the convoys that formed America's lifeline to Europe. In 1942 and early 1943, the U-boats achieved stunning success, sending hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor. Each torpedo that struck home was a validation of German strategic assumptions. Distance and danger would limit American effectiveness, would force them to husband resources, would create vulnerabilities that could be exploited. But the Americans did not husband resources. They did not scale back. They did not recalculate their strategic goals in light of mounting losses. Instead, they did something that violated every principle of scarcity that had governed European warfare. They simply built more ships, faster than the U-boats could sink them. The Liberty ship represented a revolution in industrial thinking. Based on a British design, but perfected by American engineering, these vessels were constructed using prefabricated sections, welded together with techniques that prioritized speed over elegance. The first Liberty ship took 230 days to build. Within a year, production time had dropped to 42 days. The record, set by the Robert E. Peary in November 1942, was 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. German naval analysts reviewed these reports with frank disbelief. 4 days. A ship capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, constructed in less time than it took to train a U-boat crew. The implications were staggering. Even if German submarines maintained their kill rates, which they would not, American shipyards would flood the Atlantic with vessels faster than they could be destroyed. The arithmetic was simple and brutal: abundance versus scarcity, industrial supremacy versus tactical brilliance. But the ships were only the beginning. What truly separated American logistics from anything the Wehrmacht had encountered was the systematic approach to supply chain management. The application of industrial organization principles to military operations on a scale that turned the Atlantic crossing into something resembling a factory floor stretched across an ocean. By 1943, convoys moved with clockwork precision. The Americans had developed sophisticated routing systems, air cover, from escort carriers, advanced sonar for submarine detection, and perhaps most importantly, an organizational structure that could coordinate hundreds of ships, thousands of escort vessels, and tens of thousands of tons of cargo with minimal waste and maximum efficiency. Where European armies had traditionally accepted significant loss rates in supply chains as inevitable friction of war, the Americans approached the problem like engineers troubleshooting a production line: identify inefficiencies, implement solutions, iterate and improve. The first German officers to truly grasp what they faced were those captured in North Africa. When Rommel's Africa Corps finally surrendered in May 1943, the prisoners were processed through Allied camps where they witnessed firsthand the casual abundance that characterized American military operations. One German lieutenant whose letters were later captured and analyzed by Allied intelligence wrote with barely concealed astonishment about the POW camp where he was held, "We are fed 3 times daily with rations that exceed what we received as frontline troops. There is fresh bread, canned meat, fruit, coffee, real coffee, not ersatz. And the guards seem puzzled when we express gratitude, as if abundance is the natural order of things." This was not propaganda, not deliberate demonstration for the benefit of prisoners. This was simply how American forces operated. The logistics network that supplied armies in North Africa treated POW camps with the same systematic efficiency it applied to frontline combat units, because the system was designed to handle abundance, not to carefully ration scarcity. German officers discussed this phenomenon in prison camps, trying to reconcile what they observed with their understanding of warfare. They had fought for years under conditions where every liter of fuel, every round of ammunition, every tin of food was carefully accounted for and jealously guarded. They had seen supply shortages cripple offensives, had watched talented commanders forced into defensive positions not by enemy action, but by the simple absence of resources. And now they found themselves fed by an enemy who seemed genuinely confused by their surprise at adequate rations. The contrast became even sharper when these prisoners were eventually transported to camps in the United States itself. The journey across the Atlantic, the same ocean that was supposed to be Germany's defensive barrier, was undertaken with an almost casual disregard for the strategic implications. Ships that could have carried war material instead transported prisoners because the American logistics network had capacity to spare. The prisoners traveled in relative comfort, fed regularly, provided with medical care, and upon arrival in America, they were processed through a system that seemed designed less for containment and more for administrative efficiency. One captured Wehrmacht Major Karl-Heinz Wendel later wrote in his memoirs about arriving at a POW camp in Texas, "We had been taught that Americans were soft, that their society of abundance had made them weak, unsuited for the rigors of total war. But what we witnessed was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength entirely. They had mechanized not just their factories but their thinking. Everything was system, process, optimization. They approached warfare like they approached building automobiles, and they had more automobiles than we had tanks." The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 represented the apotheosis of American logistical capability. Operation Overlord required the movement of 506,000 troops across the English Channel in a single day, supported by a supply chain that would have to sustain those troops through months of intensive combat in a hostile environment. The planning began years in advance, drawing on lessons learned in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, but scaled up to a magnitude that dwarfed previous amphibious operations. German defenders in Normandy had prepared for invasion with characteristic thoroughness. They had built the Atlantic Wall, created killing zones on the beaches, positioned artillery to cover landing areas, and mined the approaches with systematic precision. What they had not prepared for, what they could not have prepared for, was the sheer volume of material that the Allies would deliver to the beachheads once the initial landings succeeded. Within days of the invasion, American engineers had constructed artificial harbors, the famous Mulberry Harbors, capable of handling thousands of tons of supplies daily. These were not crude improvisations, but sophisticated structures that had been built in sections in England, towed across the Channel, and assembled on site with industrial precision. When a massive storm destroyed the American Mulberry on June 19, the supply effort barely slowed. Engineers simply shifted operations, cleared the beaches, and adapted with a flexibility that reflected deep reserves of material and expertise. By the end of June, Allied forces were landing 20,000 tons of supplies daily across the Normandy beaches. By August, that figure had risen to 40,000 tons. The beaches became vast staging areas where material arrived in endless streams: ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, construction equipment, medical supplies, replacement parts, and countless other items necessary to sustain modern warfare. And behind those beaches, American engineers were constructing the infrastructure necessary to move all these supplies inland, Roads, bridges, fuel depots, maintenance facilities, communication networks. German commanders facing this onslaught found themselves in a strategic situation without precedent. They were not being outfought in any traditional sense. German tactical proficiency remained formidable, their defensive positions were well chosen, their counterattacks were executed with characteristic skill. But they were being outproduced, buried under an avalanche of material that arrived with mechanical inevitability regardless of how many trucks they destroyed, how many supply depots they bombed, how many convoys they ambushed. General Günther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, later described the experience of defending against American offensives in terms that revealed a profound psychological shift. We had always understood warfare as a contest of wills where superior training, tactical innovation, and martial spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Against the Americans, we learned that there are limits to what will can achieve. It was not that they fought with greater courage or skill. In many engagements, our troops performed better man for man, but for every position we defended successfully, they would simply move around it. For every attack we repulsed, they would launch 3 more. For every tank we destroyed, 5 more appeared. They could afford to be methodical, patient, even wasteful, because waste implied scarcity, and they had no scarcity. This realization that abundance could be weaponized as effectively as any tank or aircraft represented a fundamental challenge to German military philosophy. The Wehrmacht had been forged in conditions of constraint, where efficiency and improvisation were not merely virtues, but necessities. German officers prided themselves on achieving more with less, on conducting brilliant maneuvers that substituted creativity for material. This tradition produced remarkable tactical victories, but it also created blind spots, an inability to comprehend an enemy that approached warfare from the opposite direction. The Americans were not particularly elegant in their tactical execution. They did not seek decisive maneuver battles in the Prussian tradition. They did not try to achieve victory through brilliant stratagems or desperate gambles. Instead, they applied overwhelming material force systematically, grinding forward with the patience of a glacier, accepting setbacks as temporary inconveniences rather than disasters, because they knew that tomorrow would bring fresh supplies, replacement equipment, reinforcements, and another opportunity to advance. One German officer, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, expressed this frustration with bitter clarity during interrogation. "You Americans don't fight wars, you manufacture victories, you overwhelm problems with resources until they cease to be problems. It is not warfare as we understand it. It is industrial production applied to destruction." The symbolic object that haunted German consciousness, that appeared again and again in letters, memoirs, and captured documents, was the jerrycan. This seemingly mundane item, a fuel container, became emblematic of everything the Wehrmacht faced. Ironically, the jerrycan was originally a German invention. Designed in the 1930s, the Wehrmacht's fuel container was a masterpiece of practical engineering. Pressed steel construction, 3 handles for easy carrying, an air pocket that allowed the container to float if dropped in water, and a cam-locking closure that sealed reliably. It was so superior to Allied designs that when British forces first captured German jerrycans in North Africa, they immediately began producing copies, eventually adopting the design wholesale. The Americans followed suit, manufacturing millions of these containers. But here was where the symbolic weight emerged. Germany had invented the superior design, but they could not produce enough of them. Wehrmacht supply units carefully tracked and recovered every jerrycan, treated them as valuable equipment to be jealously guarded. Losing fuel containers was considered a serious logistics failure, one that would be noted in reports and potentially impact a quartermaster's career. The Americans, by contrast, treated jerrycans as disposable. They produced them in such quantities that frontline units would sometimes abandon empty containers rather than bothering to return them through the supply chain. German troops conducting counterattacks would discover American fuel dumps with hundreds of jerrycans stacked casually, many still full, simply left behind during a rapid advance because bringing them forward was more convenient than recovering empties. This single object, German in origin, superior in design, became a daily reminder of the material disparity. German soldiers would carefully collect abandoned American jerrycans, prizing them as valuable equipment, while knowing that the enemy who had left them behind would receive replacements without even requisitioning them, that somewhere across the Atlantic. Factories were producing these containers in numbers that made each individual unit meaningless. The jerrycan appeared in German soldiers' letters home, in officers' reports, in the bitter jokes that circulated through frontline units. We invented it. They perfected the abundance of it. It represented not just material superiority, but a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. German precision and efficiency versus American mass production and systematic distribution. As Allied forces advanced into Germany itself in early 1945, the contrast between supply systems became visible in the landscape. American units moved with supply columns that stretched for kilometers, trucks following trucks in orderly succession, each one laden with material. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, mobile kitchens, mobile workshops, communication vehicles, medical units. An entire mobile infrastructure that advanced with the combat troops, keeping them supplied, maintained, and operational. German forces, by contrast, increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport. This was not a return to romantic cavalry traditions, but a desperate response to fuel shortages and vehicle losses. Wehrmacht units defending the Rhine had less mechanized transport than they had possessed in 1939. They scavenged fuel from destroyed vehicles, rationed ammunition to a degree that would have been considered catastrophic in earlier phases of the war, and made do with whatever supplies could be scraped together from diminishing stocks. The symbolic reversal was profound. The army that had pioneered mechanized warfare, that had shocked the world with the speed and coordination of its panzer divisions, was being pushed back by an enemy whose logistical train contained more vehicles than the Wehrmacht's entire remaining motor pool. When American forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they constructed bridges with a speed that stunned German observers. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was captured intact by lucky accident, but that good fortune proved almost unnecessary. American engineers built replacement bridges with industrial efficiency. Within weeks of crossing the Rhine, Allied forces had constructed multiple heavy bridges capable of handling sustained traffic, plus countless smaller spans. German demolition teams that had destroyed bridges to slow the advance discovered that they had bought hours, not days. American engineering battalions treated bridge construction like assembly line work, following standardized procedures that turned complex engineering challenges into routine tasks. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, whose observation of Antwerp harbor opened this narrative, surrendered in April 1945. In his post-war interrogations and later writings, he returned again and again to the question of logistics, trying to articulate what he had witnessed. "We were not defeated by superior strategy," he wrote. "We were not defeated by better soldiers. We were defeated by a nation that could project industrial civilization across an ocean and sustain it indefinitely. They did not outfight us. They outproduced us so thoroughly that fighting became irrelevant." Other German generals echoed similar sentiments, each trying to process the implications of what they had experienced. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, who signed Germany's unconditional surrender, later testified at Nuremberg about the strategic calculations that had led Germany into war. When questioned about the decision to allow war with America, he spoke with the exhausted clarity of a man who had watched his certainties collapse. "We knew America was large, was wealthy, had industrial capacity. But we did not understand, could not have understood from our position, what those facts meant in practical terms. We thought of America as a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, rich but soft, capable perhaps of producing material but lacking the organization, the will, the system to turn production into military effectiveness across such distances. We were wrong about everything that mattered." The question that haunted the surviving German high command was simple: how had they been so wrong? These were not stupid men, not ignorant provincials who had never studied foreign nations. They were educated professionals who had access to intelligence reports, who had analyzed production figures, who had conducted strategic assessments with meticulous care. Yet they had fundamentally miscalculated American capabilities in ways that proved catastrophic. Part of the answer lay in European assumptions about resources and industrial capacity. The German military tradition had developed in conditions of relative scarcity, where resources were finite and had to be carefully managed. This created a military culture that valued efficiency, that sought to achieve maximum results with minimum expenditure, that treated logistics as a constraining factor rather than an enabling one. Brilliant German commanders had learned to succeed despite inadequate supplies, turning limitation into virtue. Americans approached the problem from the opposite direction. They did not seek to minimize resource expenditure. They sought to overwhelm challenges with systematic application of superior material. This was not waste, though it often appeared that way to German observers. It was a different strategic calculation entirely, one that accepted higher per-unit costs in exchange for speed, flexibility, and sustained operational tempo. Moreover, German planners had failed to understand the nature of American geography and infrastructure. The United States was not just large, it was integrated. Roads, railroads, waterways, and later airways connected the nation in ways that facilitated rapid movement of goods and people. American industry was not concentrated in a few vulnerable regions, but distributed across a continent, protected by oceans from the bombing campaigns that had devastated European production centers. This meant that American productive capacity was not merely large, but resilient, capable of sustaining damage and continuing to function. But perhaps the deepest failure of German strategic thinking was cultural and ideological. Nazi ideology had taught that democracies were weak, that societies built on individual liberty and commercial values could not match the focused will of totalitarian states. This was not merely propaganda. Many German military professionals genuinely believed that democratic societies lacked the cohesion and discipline necessary for total war. The American response to Pearl Harbor shattered this assumption. The United States mobilized with a completeness that equaled or exceeded any totalitarian state, but they did so through different mechanisms. Rather than imposing mobilization through force, American society largely volunteered itself into service. War bond drives, scrap metal collections, rationing programs, and factory shifts were coordinated not primarily through coercion, but through social pressure, patriotic sentiment, and economic incentives. The result was a mobilization that was both total and somehow still recognizably American, maintaining elements of commercial culture even while subordinating them to military necessity. In the decades after the war, as historians analyzed the conflict and former enemies became Cold War allies, the question of logistics emerged as a central theme in understanding Allied victory. German generals, writing memoirs and participating in studies, repeatedly emphasized the material disparity they had faced. Some of this was self-serving. It was more comfortable to blame defeat on overwhelming numbers than to acknowledge tactical or strategic failures. But beneath the justifications, there was genuine recognition that they had encountered something unprecedented. The United States had demonstrated that modern industrial democracy could wage war with an effectiveness that matched or exceeded totalitarian mobilization, and moreover, that it could project that power globally with a logistical sophistication that redefined what was strategically possible. The Atlantic Ocean, which had protected America from European conflicts for centuries, had been transformed from a defensive barrier into a highway for industrial might. This transformation was not accidental. It emerged from deliberate planning, from innovations in shipbuilding and convoy systems, from the application of industrial organization principles to military logistics, from investments in infrastructure and transport capacity. But it also emerged from something less tangible, from a cultural assumption that abundance was normal, that problems could be solved through systematic application of resources, that distance was an engineering challenge rather than an insurmountable barrier. The jerrycan, that humble fuel container, continued to carry symbolic weight in post-war discussions. It appeared in logistics manuals, in military history studies, in conversations between former enemies. It represented the paradox at the heart of American victory. They had not invented better equipment necessarily, but they had produced adequate equipment in quantities that made qualitative distinctions irrelevant. They had turned manufacturing capacity into strategic dominance, logistical sophistication into military supremacy. The port of Antwerp, where this narrative began, continued operating after the war, returning to commercial traffic, rebuilding connections that had been severed by conflict. The cranes that had unloaded war material turned to peaceful cargo, the docks that had sustained armies returned to sustaining commerce. But the memory of what had flowed through those docks remained, a reminder of what industrial civilization could achieve when mobilized toward a single purpose. Hasso von Manteuffel lived until 1978, long enough to see the world reshape itself around American economic and military preeminence. In his later years, when asked about his experiences commanding panzer divisions, he often returned to that moment at Antwerp, watching American supplies flow ashore with mechanical precision. "I realized then," he said in one interview, "that we had been fighting the 19th century while they had already entered the 20th. We thought in terms of decisive battles, climactic moments where superior will and tactical brilliance would determine outcomes. They thought in terms of systems, of sustained pressure, of industrial processes applied to warfare. And they were right. The future belonged to logistics, not to glory." This recognition, bitter, hard-won, purchased with defeat, represented a transformation in military thinking. Warfare would never again be imagined as separate from industrial capacity, from supply chain management, from the systematic organization of resources across distances. The romantic traditions of military glory, of decisive cavalry charges and brilliant maneuvers had not disappeared entirely, but they had been subordinated to a more fundamental truth: modern warfare was industrial warfare, and victory belonged to those who could master the unglamorous complexities of logistics. The Atlantic Ocean still stretches 5,000 kilometers between continents, cold and deep and dangerous. But it has never again seemed like an insurmountable barrier, never again appeared as a defensive moat protecting one civilization from another. The Americans had crossed it not once, but continuously, had turned it into a highway for industrial might, had demonstrated that distance and water were obstacles to be overcome through systematic application of resources and intelligence. In the end, what shocked German generals was not merely that America could supply armies across an ocean. It was that they did so with an almost casual efficiency that revealed profound differences in how the two societies understood possibility itself. Where German military culture had learned to achieve brilliance within constraints, American culture had learned to remove constraints through systematic abundance. Where German officers had been taught to husband resources carefully, American logistics had been designed to deploy resources overwhelming. Where German strategy had been built on the assumption of scarcity, American power had been built on the reality of abundance. The jerrycan sits now in museums, a relic of industrial warfare, German in origin, but American in symbolic meaning. It represents not just fuel containers, but the transformation of production into power, of abundance into victory, of logistics into strategy. It reminds us that wars are won not only by soldiers on battlefields, but by factories behind them, by ports that never rest, by supply chains that stretch across oceans and continents with the patience and power of glaciers reshaping landscapes. And it suggests a truth that military historians continue to study, that strategists still grapple with, that shaped the second half of the 20th century. And continues to influence the 21st, that in modern warfare, the ability to produce, to move, to supply, and to sustain operations across distances is not merely supportive of military strategy, but is military strategy itself, the foundation upon which everything else must be built.